We have what I think right now has been widely described as a great awakening, or even the great awakening. I think at this point, the media's control over the narrative has all but imploded.
This week's special with Miles Franklin Precious Metal Investments. Kilo Valcambi silver bars for only $2.75 over spot. 10-ounce Nadir silver bars for only $2.95 over spot. Call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. I'm your host, Dunnigan Kaiser, and our guest today is a returning one. Alex Newman is an author, an educator, and a journalist on freedom, liberty, and the rights of the natural family. Alex, thanks for joining us again here on Liberty and Finance.
Thanks so much for having me, Dunnigan. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you.
We love seeing your influence spreading. We've seen now you're an official contributor at the Epoch Times newspaper. We know that you're involved in the Red Pill Expo and the Liberty Sentinel and so on. We're always glad for that, because wherever you go, you spread truth and awareness and rationality and hard thinking, as well as a rootedness in history and what's come before us and where it's likely indicating that we're going to be heading unless we assert ourselves in our own lives. Could you talk to us today about, will we ever see our freedoms again? You and I did an interview a little over a month ago where we went through many different categories of encroachments on our natural rights and our natural freedoms and privacies by the state, and in the face of unconstitutionality, and that's been going on for a long time. And the question is there a path back to freedom? And if you could start by corroborating for us, what are the most pressing signs and trends right now that are indicating to you that a return to freedom, a return to constitutionality is not what the keepers of the keys have in store for us or planned for us, and then we'll transition into what we can do about it.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dunnigan. Again, it's a pleasure to be here with you. And I think it is beyond clear that the elites, the ruling classes, at least the self-proclaimed ruling classes, have much more tyranny in store for us if they get their way. And I think it's a big if. But they have made their wishes clear. They intend to continue expanding government. They intend to continue curtailing our liberties, even liberties that we didn't think of as liberties that needed to be defended a couple of years ago are now in the crosshairs. Our freedom to work, our freedom to go shopping without having to take medical treatments, our freedom to be able to operate in the economy without having to show our papers. I mean, these are fundamental freedoms at the most basic level that I think a couple of years ago would have seemed inconceivable that we'd have to be fighting for these liberties. And I think if the elites are able to continue on this trajectory, it's going to get worse and it's going to get darker. And that's what they have in mind. That's what they have planned. That is their objective. Now, the question of whether they will succeed or not is an entirely separate question. And I think right now it's really up in the air. I think there are some very, very positive developments, Dunnigan, that bode very well for the future. We have what I think right now has been widely described as a great awakening, or even the great awakening. I think at this point, the media's control over the narrative has all but imploded. And you wouldn't know that from watching the media. I think that's one of the most valuable tools in their arsenal, is keeping us kind of isolated and believing that we're the only ones who see what's going on, when in reality, all around us, if you just talk to the regular people in your community, there is this massive awakening. People are just scared to talk to each other because they've been conditioned to believe that, well, my neighbor is going to think I'm an extremist. My church people are going to think I'm a right winger, all these nasty terms. And so people are still a little bit in their shells, scared to talk. But I can tell you the narrative has absolutely collapsed. There are still some people that are watching CNN. Apparently, at prime time, they get something like 800,000 viewers. And it's not a lot. It's not nothing. It's less than Ancient Aliens gets at that time. But, it's not nothing. 800,000 people. And some of these are still decision makers. They're serving in state legislatures. They're serving in Congress. So their influence over the narrative remains. But I think as far as the general public is concerned, it has all but collapsed. In fact, just a couple of days ago, CNN was whining about how, well, if people stop watching us, how are they going to get the information that they need? Oh, yeah, okay. So we also see, I think, a real awakening about the urgency of this. People who a few years ago, they might have been uncomfortable with the direction things were going, but not uncomfortable enough to turn off the football game and run for office or get involved in a campaign or start sharing information with their neighbors or the leaders at their church. I think that urgency is building. People are now realizing that, hey, it's now or never. And if we don't do something, the future we're going to be leaving, maybe not even for our children, maybe just, a couple of years down the line, it's going to be horrific. So I'm very encouraged by what's happening on that front. I think if we had an honest election in 2022, the totalitarians would be absolutely clobbered. I think to get elected, the politicians are going to have to at least talk in a liberty-minded way. And, I think there's still a lack of awareness among the voters that a lot of the people who campaign on a freedom agenda end up stabbing us in the back. But I think as far as the public is concerned, I see really encouraging things. We've talked about this before, the massive exodus out of the public school system. People look at a country like North Korea and say, how could a totalitarian dictatorship have existed for multiple generations? And honestly, a totalitarian dictatorship cannot exist like that without at least some modicum of consent from the governed. And the way they got it in North Korea was by indoctrinating successive generations of children into believing that this is the only way things can be, that this is the right way for things to be, that there are constant threats that the regime is protecting them from. And so there's a very real risk that a system like that could be installed at a global level. But when we see millions of families fleeing the public school system, when we see tens of millions of parents recognizing that their children are being indoctrinated and taking deliberate steps to counter that indoctrination, I think that bodes very well for the future as well. Then again, so I think there's a lot of good things happening, but I don't want to sugarcoat it. The elites still have a lot of tools at their disposal. They've been doing now, just as one example, recently these exercises on the cyber pandemic, where they've been talking about shutting down telecommunications and the internet. And they're doing war games. What if this happened? How would we react? But this is exactly the type of exercises they were running before the big great events of early 2020. And we see that the rehearsals that they do end up playing out in the real world very frequently. And so I think we need to be aware of the fact that just because people are waking up, just because people see through the lies, doesn't mean we're out of the woods yet. We could see an economic collapse, and I think that may be closer than we'd like to believe. We could see catastrophic issues like EMPs. In talking to the congressional task force on EMP, the chairman there, he said that the likelihood is high, that the devastation would be incalculable. He estimated that probably 90% of Americans would die. So I don't want to sugarcoat it and say, hey guys, everything's going to be fine. Let's be Pollyannas and we just got to get involved in politics and we're going to rescue our freedoms. But there are a lot of good things happening that make me optimistic.
Some of the things you mentioned in passing there, we do see playing out quite severely in certain areas of the world. We've spoken with Australian economist John Adams, who talks about the lockdowns that they have been suffering under there, and the irrationality and the complete disconnect, the unscientific facts that don't bear out, that using such severe methods to restrict people's freedoms as though that we're going to benefit, and then the benefits are not shown. We've seen that playing out in different countries of the world that have used severe restrictions on people's lives, whether it's on their business lives or whether it's on their travel or whether it's on the ability to associate, etc. And we also see a moving of the goalposts, and it never being, let's have the maximum amount of health, wellness, well-being, let's prevent death, for example. But no, it becomes moving the goalposts, and now it's not about driving down case counts and things like that, which and that's what's worth completely disrupting people's lives for. Can you talk with us for the moment about the disconnect between science, reason on the one hand, and dictates and policies on the other hand?
Well, it is absolutely massive. And this is actually not a new problem. In fact, my entire career in journalism, I've been observing this problem up close and personal. Very shortly after I graduated from journalism school with a degree in journalism, I headed off to Copenhagen to cover the UN Climate Summit. I believe it was the COP15. And I was not a climate expert, but I had talked to some climate experts. And in fact, I talked to some of the people who were in Copenhagen. And it was very clear to me that there was a massive level of deception going on. And I heard things that just sounded so preposterous. Al Gore was there, for example. And he gave this big public speech. They rallied all the journalists around. I call them the cheerleading section because they're really not doing journalism in any legitimate sense of the term. They're there to cheerlead. And so he rallied all these journalists and policymakers and said, we believe that within 5 to 7 years, the entire North Polar ice cap may be gone. And I think, what? That sounds just absolutely crazy. And, all the stenographers there dutifully typed that up. Oh, my goodness, in 5 to 7 years, the North Polar ice cap may be gone. And of course, we all knew, anybody with common sense who had looked at the data, who had studied these issues, knew that was simply ludicrous. There was no way that was going to happen. 5 to 7 years later came. And not only had the North Polar ice cap not disappeared, it had massively, massively expanded from the levels that it was at when Al Gore made those ludicrous statements. Now, did all these journalists go back and correct the record and call up Al Gore and say, hey, do you have a comment? You couldn't have been more wrong, man. You said it was going to be gone. It grew massively. How could you have been so wrong? Why should we ever quote you again? None of that, right? We just completely forgot about it. It disappeared from the news cycle. And that's what we see constantly now with this bizarre obsession with following the science. It's not even about the science. It's not even pseudoscience. It's just the bizarre pronouncements of some individual who's got a PhD in something or a degree in something or a formal sounding title. And what you see is the solutions, the so-called science pronounced by these individuals the solution is always give up more freedom, less prosperity for you, more centralization of power at the governmental level, whether that be at the national, the regional, like the European Union, or even the global at the UN level. And this is the solution to everything. And you see it perfectly with the climate thing, right? In the 70s, and even into the 80s, they were telling us that global cooling was the catastrophe that we all had to be terrorized about. And incidentally, they said that CO2 was causing the global cooling. Man-made CO2 was going to lead to this catastrophic global cooling, and it was going to cause crop failures, and we were all doomed. But if we would just agree to reduce fossil fuel consumptions, give up more freedom, lower our standard of living, give the UN a whole lot more power, we could be saved from the global cooling, from our carbon sins. Now, that is, of course, the exact solution that they offered for, and there were some add-ons. They wanted to cover the Arctic ice cap with black soot, is what they said in Time magazine in a big 1975 article. They said the scientists thought that would be a good way of mitigating the global cooling. And in retrospect, we look back at that and think, man, that would have been embarrassing to have said that. But notice the solutions to the global warming are the same. And the solutions to the current madness are the same. Give up your freedom, suffer a lockdown, do what we say, give more power to the government, and we're going to save you from the boogeyman that the so-called science is telling you exists. And the objective is always to move us closer to the direction of technocracy, right? Get rid of self-government. Don't let the people determine their own lives. Don't let them make their own decisions. Don't even let them elect their own representatives who have actual control over these things. The real governance needs to be moved over to the technocrats, to the scientists and engineers who are beyond any kind of political accountability, who cannot be removed, who cannot be fired. And so this is one of those issues that we're going to have to deal with if freedom is going to survive over the long term. We have to get away from this crazy idea that just because somebody has a PhD, we all need to do what they say. Government by expert doesn't work. It's a failure. It's a proven failure. And it's not compatible with freedom. Even if there is some scientific problem that needs to be addressed, that needs to be done while respecting the individual rights of citizens. It needs to be done while respecting our constitutional form of government, our representation in the political decisions that guide us. And we need to get away from the idea that government is the solution to all problems. Government has a very specific job. Its job is to punish evil. Evil is robbery, rape, murder. I mean, that's the job of the government. We need to get away from the idea that government's job is to take care of us, to feed us, to educate our children, to do whatever the science says. And if we don't get away from that, the freedom is not going to survive, and it's just that simple.
One of the things you touched on there is the illogical and unscientific mandates that are then wrapped in. You said it's not even pseudoscience, so it's basically under the color of science or whatever, just calling something what it isn't by saying this is science, follow the science, do what we say, and it's almost as though we've been taught for generations that science is to thank for a lot of our technological and lifestyle improvements, that sort of thing, and therefore, if somebody just uses that word, then you can just shut down your thinking and just do whatever they say. It's a very strange thing, because as a homeschool dad and science teacher for all my kids, I'm just stunned when I see the influence that mainstream media and the as you mentioned, the technocracy messages that get sent there, because it defies common sense, or it even defies logic. It's not rational, some of these pronouncements. This is not a unique problem. I think that there's been a lot of hand-wringing going on about the loss of the ability to think critically about things and to communicate, realizing that just relabeling things doesn't change their essence, their nature. Can you talk to us about why critical thinking and common sense are so important, and what people need to do, not only in wrestling that back for themselves, trusting themselves, but also teaching their children?
Yeah, what you just said, I think, is so critical, Dunnigan. And I've watched this happen in the education system. Education is one of my passions, and so I followed very closely the things that are happening in education policy. The same people who brought you Common Core, this is a group of elitists, Bill Gates, of course, big financier. You've got these trade operations, really lobbying groups in Washington, D.C., like the National Governors Association, all these different front groups. And then, of course, the front groups they set up specifically for these purposes, like Achieve Inc., which was run by a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a Bilderberg attendee. So the elites, they set up these front groups to move these things forward. One of the things they created was it's called the Next Generation Science Standards. And these have been implemented now across many, if not most of our states, and they hope to make them national. And, of course, they're aligned with international standards. And one of the things that is most apparent when you look through these, as somebody who values science, is that this is not science. It is literally not science. And in fact, the thing that really jumped out at me, Dunnigan, is that in 12 years of learning so-called science in a public school under these next generation science standards, these children will never even hear the term scientific method. It's just not included as part of the standards, period, from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. How can you teach children about science if you're not going to teach them the scientific method? Science is not a god with a little g. Science is not an entity. Science is a process. And that process, the most fundamental beginning of that process, is the scientific method, being able to observe and come up with hypotheses and test those hypotheses. When you get rid of that, you're not dealing with science anymore. You're dealing in the realm of superstition, fraud. And so what we're dealing with here is not science. And if we do want to recover a free and civilized society, we have to get back to a proper understanding of what science even is in the first place. That means, in addition to that, we need to bring in logic and we need to bring in common sense. So there's a deliberate effort to suppress true science. And you see this. How could it be that an entire generation of young people could be raised to believe that the Earth is getting warmer because of our CO2 emissions when there is no actual science to support this? If you look at the actual science that's coming out, even in the peer-reviewed literature, I mean, this is not something that's observable. It's not something that's testable. And this is true across a whole range of issues. And they keep getting proven wrong. So they come up with these hypotheses. I did an article on this in the New American magazine years ago. In fact, I did two, looking at the hypotheses that they came up, and they don't even call them hypotheses. They call them the science, when really they're coming up with a hypothesis that says if CO2 increases by X amount, for example, then we expect the temperature to increase by X amount. So they come up with these hypotheses. They call it the science, and they don't even phrase it as a hypothesis. They say if CO2 increases, the temperature is going to get warmer. You know, that's their opinion. They state it as if it were a fact. And then we look at the timeline they give us, and that thing didn't happen. And so in real science, you would look at that and say, hey, your hypothesis was incorrect. You hypothesized that this increase in CO2 would cause this increase in temperature. Nothing happened to the temperature. Your hypothesis was wrong. Go back to the drawing board. That is what science is. And yet what they are calling the science has no resemblance to actual science. So this begins in the classroom. If you had a populace that was well educated in logic, that was well educated in understanding actual science, that was even just had basic common sense and could look at these things and say, you said that would happen, that didn't happen, therefore I probably should stop paying attention to your pronouncements, especially when they involve me having to surrender all my freedom and reduce standard of living. This is just basic stuff. So I think if we're going to restore freedom, and I've said this for many years, the most important single thing, other than maybe divine intervention, is we have to ensure that the next generation is capable of thinking. Right now, they are being systematically deprived, and yes, I mean it's a systemic problem, not like systemic racism, which is a fairy tale. It's a systemic problem. The system is engineered to deprive your children of critical things that they need, including first of all, and most basically, the ability to read. I wrote an entire book on this with Dr. Sam Blumenfeld. They have literally turned us into a nation of illiterates at the highest levels. They know exactly what they're doing. They did it on purpose. In fact, you can go back to John Dewey. He knew this is what it would happen, and he did it anyway. Ergo, he almost certainly did it on purpose. So they're depriving our children of the ability to read. That makes them completely dependent on the television and the pronouncements of experts for their information. Whereas if they could read, they could go consult an encyclopedia. They could go on the internet and look for alternative viewpoints. They could pick up a book. Imagine that. So at the most basic level, they're being deprived of the ability to read. They're being deprived of the ability to reason. Even basic logic, deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, I mean, these are no longer taught in the public school system. It's not an accident. It's deliberate, because if people could think logically, they would recognize right away, hey, that politician just used a logical fallacy. That makes no sense. I don't have to submit to that. That's crazy. So if we're going to move forward in a positive direction, I think one of the most, if not the most critical things that we could do is make sure that the next generation is educated properly. Unfortunately, that is not happening in the public school system. That cannot happen in the current public school system. Even if you run for school board and you win, you're not going to be able to reform it. I can guarantee it. So right now, the only option I see on that front is get your children out, educate them at home, find a good private school, a good Christian school, a good co-op, get together with a group of parents and hire a tutor. There's all kinds of options out there. But if we're going to raise a generation that's going to be capable of sustaining freedom and the institutions that make freedom possible, the rule of law, limited government, a free press, these types of basic things, they're going to have the basics, the ability to read, the ability to reason, the ability to use common sense. And right now they're being deprived of all those things.
Another thing, I think you've touched up on it several times here, but if we could focus on it for a moment, is this idea of if you start out with asking the wrong questions or setting up the wrong goals, you're going to get the wrong actions, you're going to get the wrong outcomes. And for example, in the current public health crisis, if that's what you want to call it, there's been an abysmal neglect. Almost, it's just a, I don't know what to call it, just a malpractice of neglect of the science would say you observe reality. And so if your goal is the minimizing the damage to people's health, damage to their lives, that sort of thing, then you would say, well, what works? Let's look at all possible experiences of doctors on the front lines and who are treating actual patients and who's having success. What's working? I mean, that's the scientific observation where you look at reality, you observe, and then you start to form. You quickly lock onto what's effective. But if you don't start with the goal being minimizing the suffering and death of ordinary people, but if your real goal is control, well, then you keep coming up with these distorted gymnastics of logic to say, well, if a little bit of control isn't doing any good, let's do a lot more control. And if that didn't do any good, let's just double it down again. My main concern with this is not that there are people in the world who would do that sort of thing or recommend that sort of thing. It's that the majority of the people don't see it for what it is and say, wait a minute, you're asking the wrong question. Why aren't you doing the right thing? Can you help us understand maybe how we got off track on this and what kinds of questions we need to be asking ourselves and teaching our children to ask so that we catch them, catch the so-called leaders when they're doing these sort of things to us?
Yeah, and I think a perfect example of that, these people were caught red-handed. The emails have now come out between Dr. Fauci and Collins over at the NIH, and the Great Barrington Declaration came out. And these were scientists and medical professionals from Harvard and from Stanford and from Oxford saying, look, if the goal is public health, we're really harming people's public health with these policies. We need a different approach. We need to maybe, protect the extremely vulnerable individuals, people who are of an advanced age or people who have comorbidities that would be dangerous. And the rest of the population needs to be free to go about their business. They need to be able to go visit the doctor if they have a concern. They need to be able to go get their cancer treatments or whatever it is, right? And so that's a perfect example. And what we saw with Fauci and Collins was we need a devastating takedown of it. Not like, well, hey, they're probably wrong, a better way to protect people's health. It's not about protecting people's health. It's about pushing control. And I think the way that they have successfully brought this situation about, where you had such a big percentage of the population not even asking the right questions, not even thinking critically about these issues, was several different elements here. The one I think that was critical was fear, and one of Hitler's top henchmen explained at the Nuremberg trials that the way we get people to do what we want them to do is we scare them, right? Then it works the same in any system of government. I think that's one of the reasons why in the Bible God says 365 times, "Fear not," right? Fear is a bad emotion. It's an inappropriate response to most things, and it often leads to doing very, very dumb mistakes. And that's what we saw in this so-called public health crisis. They deliberately, obviously deliberately, I mean, it was just constant barrage of fear-mongering. You're going to die. Your kids are going to die. Your grandma's going to die. If you go outside, you're a murderer. It was all fear-based. There was no element of rationality here. It was just fear. And so that caused a panic among the general population. And then they stepped in and they said, hey, we're going to protect you from the thing that we've now caused you to fear. All you have to do is give up your freedom, give up your money, let us take all these new powers that were inconceivable just a few months ago, and then you won't have to be fearful anymore. So that was a very, very strategic operation. I can guarantee you people spent a lot of time thinking about this before actually putting it into practice. We've got evidence that they spent a lot of time thinking about this. When we go back and read the 2010 Rockefeller Foundation report where they had the section on lockstep. And you see that this was the agenda. They understood the tools that they would have to use to get people to comply with this, and they were very successful in doing it. And, of course, silencing alternative voices was a key part of that, right? If you have voices out there saying, wait, we don't need to panic, folks, and in fact, even if we are scared, this isn't a good solution to deal with our fears, then a free press, essentially, doing the job that a free press is supposed to do. If you had that in place, again, this process would have been arrested. It would have been stopped in its tracks. Unfortunately, they had planned for that as well. And so if you look at Event 201 that took place just a few months before the actual pandemic began and the fear-mongering cranked up, one of the key elements of the response to a hypothetical novel coronavirus coming out of China, again, funded by Bill Gates, funded by the World Economic Forum, took place at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins. One of the key things that they focused on was how do we control the narrative? How do we make sure that we can stop the spread of misinformation, as they called it, spreading through social media? Well, we got to stop the spread. We've got to censor people. We've got to lock that down. One of the guys who was participating in this exercise, I think he was from Singapore, said we need to even consider the possibility of prosecuting people for fake news. And by fake news, of course, they meant anyone who questions the wisdom of these outlandish policies. So you had the fear factor. You had the factor where all voices that were not going along with the narrative were silenced, either through terror or through just outright censorship. Doctors who tried to speak out about these issues were labeled as quacks. They had their medical license threatened. They were fired from their jobs. They were painted as even potential terrorists who were going to be responsible for the death of huge numbers of people. And then the third element, which we talked about just a moment ago, is the education. If we had a well-educated populace, if we had the mainstream of the American people who had received a legitimate education, who understood the lessons of history and how tyrants always use fear to market their totalitarianism, if we understood logic, we would have understood that just because there is a virus, it doesn't follow that we need to give up our freedoms. Right? Basic logic 101. The conclusion does not follow from the premises. Right? We don't need to give up our freedom just because there's a scary virus out there. So just a basic education with the basic ability to reason properly would have prevented this. So you have those three factors all working in unison to get us into what Dr. Robert Malone recently popularized this term, the mass formation psychosis, a term that was actually developed by a psychologist over at the University of Ghent, Matthias Desmet, I believe his name was. And that's where you have a big part of the population that enters into this kind of collective psychosis where they're not thinking clearly anymore, kind of like this mob psychology where you just lose control of your faculties, you just do whatever the mob is doing. And that's not to say that everybody fell into this. In fact, Robert Malone said, maybe 1/3 have been sucked up into this, 1/3 kind of don't know what to make of it, and then the other third are very skeptical of the narrative. They have not swallowed it, but that 1/3 is extremely dangerous, and we've seen this unbelievable reaction where our fellow citizens are screaming at each other and hitting each other and calling the police on each other for not wearing a mask or for not having a vaccine passport or going out without permission. This is a psychological problem that I think the elites and the establishment have studied for a long time. They recognize it. They understand how to exploit these psychological vulnerabilities that people have, this desire to feel secure, this desire to be protected from things that are scary. And so you combine all of that, and it culminated in this disaster that we're experiencing on a global level. You mentioned Australia. They're bearing, the brunt of this, but people in California, New York, I'm here in Florida, praise God, it's, We've avoided most of the most draconian horrors that we've seen in other places, but this has been a worldwide phenomenon, unprecedented in human history, and I don't think it could have happened without each of those elements having been in place.
In totalitarian regimes in the past, and we've heard about this in like prisoner of war camps and things like that as well, there's this idea of making an example of someone who doesn't toe the line, and that's enough then to keep the other 1,000 people in line, even though they far outnumber their oppressors. I think that another place that there's always a vulnerability in this groupthink that you talked about is that if there's this cloud of fear, and then there are a few examples, see that person died, and that person died, and that person died, even if the policies were necessary to withhold supportive care or early treatment, or, it's not that the government hasn't done this before. Those who aren't familiar with the Tuskegee experiment should really look up and see that this is not the first time that officialdom have forced medical doctors to withhold curative treatment from their patients, even when the patients come in and beg for treatment to be healed of the disease that they're suffering from, and the doctors are being told, no, you must not treat that disease. And where we get the obedience to do the wrong thing in the face of evil like that is one avenue of questioning. But the other is just the admission, the fact that this is a human vulnerability we have, is that if we don't realize that people are actually withholding good, withholding curing, withholding treatment, withholding safe and effective, inexpensive and available methods to avoid some of these most drastic consequences, that then when people can point to those drastic consequences, they see we, the group who are supporting each other in this fear-based groupthink, have good reason, because look at these bad things that happened. And it's just not clear to many that those bad things didn't have to happen. There have been doctors who have specifically testified even before Congress saying there don't need to be any more deaths beyond, and this was many, many months ago, any more deaths beyond this point are on your hands if you continue to withhold treatment from people. So can you talk to us about that principle, that sort of that evil grain of truth, if you want to call it that people can point to and say, well, see that example, that justifies all of this illogical thinking, because you can actually point to that bad thing that happened.
Yeah, and that's part of the fear-based propaganda and the fear-based policy making. They need some way to drum up fear. And so if there's a legitimate fear out there, it's rather easy to say, well, look, there's a legitimate fear, you should be afraid. And then that's where you come in with the wrong solution. That's then the problem is the wrong solution, not necessarily that somebody raised concerns about something. What I think we saw with this one was a deliberate effort to manufacture unfounded fear, right? There's a defense mechanism built into the human being that if there is something of concern, we try to take action. And it's very much like with a computer, garbage in, garbage out. If you've been led to believe that something should be feared when it really shouldn't be, then you're liable to make very dumb decisions. And if you've been whipped up into a panic to the point where you're not even thinking rationally anymore, you're liable to make really dumb decisions, like surrendering your freedoms, like agreeing to shut down and destroy your business, like agreeing to allow the government to take these unprecedented powers that have never existed in a free society and should never exist in a free society. So it's a matter of using specific examples to and I turned on CNN during the height of the pandemic. This was summer of 2020, and I didn't actually turn it on. I was in a hotel lobby and it was kind of rolling, and this was when everybody was really, really terrified. And as I watched CNN and realized that this is what my fellow Americans were being exposed to, if you believe that that's real, it's understandable that you'd be very concerned about it. And it's understandable that if somebody says, well, hey, this is one way of dealing with this danger, that you might go along with it. So I think the problem, again, we go back to the free press. If we had a free press that said, well, yeah, somebody died of that COVID, and yeah, you don't want to be irresponsible. You don't want to deliberately run around spreading it. But, if you look at the numbers and if you look at the early treatments that are available, it's really not something that we need to be in a panic about. If we had a free press and if the American people had been informed of that, I think it would have been a much more sensible response. We never would have allowed our politicians to order us to stay home or to order us to do X, Y, Z. But because we lack a free press in this country and because we have just been conditioned to accept these pronouncements, it really has led to, I think, a crisis situation. And I think people are now starting to come out of the days, and I mentioned it earlier at the beginning of this program, I do think the narrative has now collapsed. I think the fear-based propaganda has blown over. In fact, our Surgeon General here in the state of Florida, Dr. Joe Ladapo, when he came in, I loved his opening remarks. We're done with fear-based policymaking. Like, that was the perfect thing to say. And I don't think people appreciated the depth of that statement, the significance of that statement, because fear-based policymaking is exactly what was going on. They were deliberately whipping up fear for the purpose of advancing policies that they wanted anyway. And so to have a senior official of one of the most important states in the union come out and say, we're not going to do the fear-based policymaking anymore, that was a very significant thing. Now we need to replicate that in the 50 states and say, look, we need to look at things in a rational manner, in an objective manner. We don't want to needlessly stir up fear. If there's a danger, there are ways of dealing with that. That's where we need to go. It's back to a rational thinking, but I think it's very difficult without a free press. And anybody who watches, YouTube has certainly noticed a lot of voices have been removed. Anybody who uses Twitter, I mean, when they can take down the president of the United States and some of his top people in one fell swoop, you realize an entire side of the debate, if you will, has been completely silenced, at least silenced on the platforms that are available to the masses. And this leads to the kind of devastating tragedies that we have seen in the United States and around the world over the last few years. That's how significant this lack of a free press, this lack of free communication and free speech becomes. It enables things that otherwise would never be possible.
And that's exactly what I was going to ask you about next is, you've mentioned homeschooling. I'm sure we'll circle back to that in just a few minutes. But if you could first touch on this idea of where people can go to get a broader and more representative version of events that allow them to open up their rational mind. Because if all you're listening to is this barrage of either fear or illogical control measures, that sort of thing, you don't even have time to clear your head enough to even think clearly about things. So where do you advise people should consider as alternative sources?
There are a lot of them, and I'd say your show is one of the top ones up there, Dunnigan. You do amazing work bringing on good guests and just presenting facts in a clear, concise manner, and bringing on voices that are not necessarily going to be heard on CNN or even Fox News. So I would recommend to people to, if you're not subscribed to this channel yet, hit the subscribe button. If you have friends and family and neighbors in your circle of influence, share this video, share other videos by Dunnigan. I'm a senior editor at the New American Magazine. You can see it behind me. It's been around as long as I've been alive, and it was actually the merger of two previous publications. I think it is the best magazine, bar none, on planet Earth, at least that I know of, in terms of good reporting, truthful reporting, accurate reporting, and seeing through the fluff, right? You're not going to find a lot of articles in there about celebrity did this or the sports scores or whatever. But the news that is truly important for maintaining a free society, for protecting your family, for understanding the world around us. The New American is second to none when it comes to publication. So you can subscribe to the print issue of that. I think I probably have some copies around here. This is a special one we did recently, Trump World, just looking at kind of the not necessarily Trump himself, but the people surrounding Trump. And then the movement that built up and coalesced around him. So that's one option. There's also, if you don't want to subscribe to the print magazine, it comes to you twice a month. You can get the daily headlines. They'll come to your email inbox every day or every week or every month, depending on what you select. And 5 articles a day. It's not too much. It'll be the key stories that our editors think are the most important for people to be aware of. We've also got a report card for members of Congress. So your congressman might come home and go to all the conservative clubs and say, hey, guys, I'm representing you in Washington, and I believe in small government, and I want to maintain your freedom. Well, we actually get their voting record and judge it based on the Constitution, and they get an objective score. And if your congressman comes home and says he's a great conservative, and then you see his voting record is a 0% or a 12%, 100% in alignment with the Constitution, then you have a problem. So these are practical tools. Another really good one that I can't recommend highly enough is the Epoch Times. It's now the fourth largest newspaper in America by subscription after the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. So a very sizable force. And again, it's a source where you can go for important information, for objective analyses, for voices that you're not going to hear elsewhere, even though they're important, even though truth is being spoken. So that's a good one. You can find it at theepochtimes.com. You can get a subscription. They'll mail you the print edition once a week or more if you're in D.C. or New York markets. My personal website is libertysentinel.org. It's not like a daily news site, but I do put up stuff that I think is very, very important for people. That's libertysentinel.org. And then there's a lot of other outfits out there that I scan on a regular basis. Some of them are more reliable than others. Some of them are less reliable, but still it's good, I think, to get a broad view of what people are talking about. There's a lot of good commentators increasingly that are becoming known on alternative platforms. So a lot of good places out there. And what I recommend to people as well is even the current events is important, and people should stay up on the current events, but the background to be able to make sense of current events is critical. And so I tell people, if you're not a reader, you're hurting yourself. There's so much information stored in books. I mean, thousands of years of civilization has produced an incredible amount of wisdom, an incredible amount of knowledge. And if we're just looking at current events in isolation, without any historical perspective, without any broader understanding, we're really only getting a tiny sliver. We're seeing the tip of the iceberg. So I recommend to people, read books and do it deliberately and do it frequently. And, we don't have time for a book list. I could go on for hours and hours. There's so many, but I grew up as a reader. I loved reading. And so when you have that, and it's pathetic, I'll mention this, in a lot of schools now, there's this new philosophy that's kind of taken root since Google came along in the education establishment, that we don't need to teach children facts anymore because they can just go to Google and type in something and then Google's going to tell them, so they don't need to bother memorizing facts. Well, that's cute until you realize that if you don't have the facts in your head, you can't connect the dots, and so things don't make sense. You got to have the facts stored up here so that you can build a comprehensive picture of what's going on. So I tell people, make sure you're reading. Even the literature is important, the Shakespeare and stuff, but the Bible, the history books. I mean, if you don't have a well-rounded, big picture understanding beyond just current events is going to be nonsensical, and you're almost wasting your time following it. So I would encourage people to get involved in deliberately reading almost as much as I would encourage people to stay up on top of with reliable sources of information for current events, Dunnigan.
Yeah, in fact, you can wrestle back some free time, if you want to call it that, in your life for reading by unplugging from some of that deluge of obsession on current events that are being, propagated to us through the mainstream media. That's one of the places you can get the time to do that reflective reading and thinking. One last touch, if you would, for parents who have grave concerns about their children's education or lack thereof, and feel intimidated at the thought of, I don't have time, I don't know where to start. Where are a few toeholds that parents can start to learn about homeschooling or different options other than government schooling?
PublicSchoolExit.com, I think, is the best resource out there. And I don't just say that because I'm the executive director. I say that because we've made a conscious, very deliberate effort to be that resource for parents and pastors and people thinking about this just as a starting point. So you can go to PublicSchoolExit.com and, we walk you through all of it. If you're just starting, why do you need to exit? Can you do it? What are some ideas for what you do once you do exit? We've got an advisory board that is second to none. I mean, I've never seen a group of liberty-minded educational experts assembled like this anywhere. I've never seen it. So our advisory board, and we can connect you with those people. If you're a parent and you're wondering, where do I go from here? We've also got a school vetting service. So we look at Christian schools across the country. They fill out an application for us, and if they meet our standards, then we'll be happy to list them there. So you can see if there's any good schools around you. We have people who will help set up a co-op in your church. We have people who will help you build a Christian school from the ground up, if that's what you choose to do. We've got endless resources for how you can start homeschooling. We have actually the former superintendent of public instruction for the state of Arizona, Diane Douglas, who's on our board. She did, I think, one of the most valuable services anybody could have done for this movement, and she went through the laws in every state. so that there's now a comprehensive database on our website. You can find it right there at publicschoolexit.com. For, if you live in Kansas, what are the requirements when you pull your child out of school? For some states, it's as simple as you pull them out and that's the end of it. Or you just never register them to start with. If your child hasn't gone to school yet, you don't have to tell the government anything. You're not required to inform anyone. And so you can just get started. In other states, there's a lot of hoops you got to jump through. And if you don't jump through the hoops and fill out all the right forms and let them know and tell them what curriculum you're going to use and make sure you take the tests every year, you might find CPS at your door. So we made it real simple. We had Diane Douglas go through all those state laws, and she's got all of that in one comprehensive document. You can just look up your state and see, what is the next step. If you're in Illinois, nothing. You just pull them out. If you're in Massachusetts, well, you're going to have to send letters. You're going to have to fill out forms. You're going to have to do this, that, and the other. So I can't recommend it highly enough. We live in an era now where homeschooling and alternative education has never been easier. There's never been more resources in the history of humanity to help you do it. There's a co-op in practically every little town, every city in this country if you want to get plugged in with a network of homeschoolers. So it really is a great time. At this point, the public schools are the naked emperor. I mean, everybody can see that the emperor is naked. It's just some people don't quite want to admit it yet, but we all see what's going on. They're brainwashing and they're dumbing down our kids. The government's own data proves it. So, folks, if you value your children, if you value your family, if you value your freedoms, if you value your country, and if you want what's best for your kids and for their future and for your family and for your country, this, I think, is one of those critical issues that is really a starting point. It's the most basic. So.
Well, we've been speaking with Alex Newman. Alex, thank you for being generous with your time. Alex Newman of Public School Exit and Liberty Sentinel and The New American. All of those we're going to have links to in the description of this video. Alex, as always, on behalf of all of our viewers and our families and our children and our grandchildren, thank you for joining us here again on Liberty and Finance.
Thank you so much for having me, Dunnigan. Always an honor and a pleasure. Really appreciate it.
This is Dunnigan Kaiser, founder of Liberty and Finance. I'm now a licensed gold and silver broker for Miles Franklin. Call me directly for the physical gold and silver that you need at the best price with personalized private service from one of the oldest and best companies in the business. 31 years strong, A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau, 0 complaints, licensed and bonded. For physical delivery, vault storage, or precious metals IRAs, excellent prices, privacy, and confidentiality. Pay by check, money order, ACH, bank wire, or Bitcoin. Satisfaction guaranteed. For fastest service, just call 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 888-81-LIBERTY. And either I or one of my sons and fellow brokers will call you back as soon as we can and understand your needs.